Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history. Picking up where we left off last time, we move into the 9th Ecumenical Council. In that enumeration, Vatican II is the 21st Ecumenical Council. This, Council number 9, was the first council held at the Lateran, the Basilica and Palace. The Lateran, St. John Lateran, is the cathedral of the Pope in his capacity as Bishop of Rome. There would be 5 of those 21 church councils held at the Lateran so far, and this was the first. Pope Callistus II used his family connections to summon, well, he summoned it on his own, but he used his family connections to ensure a good attendance, both from the secular rulers and their representatives, as well as ecclesiastical rulers. It met from the 18th of March through the 27th of March in the year 1123. Over 300 bishops and abbots from all over Europe attended, and it produced 22 canons. Canon 1 condemned the sin of simony, again, which is the purchase of ecclesiastical office. Skipping down, Canon 3 once again reinforced previous papal teachings about celibacy, but this is the first one at an ecumenical council. So Canon 3 reads, "We absolutely forbid priests, deacons, and subdeacons to associate with concubines and women, or to live with women other than such as the Nicene Council, for reasons of necessity, permitted, namely the mother, sister, or aunt, or any such person concerning whom no suspicion could arise." And that's from Canon 3 of the First Council of Nicaea, the First Ecumenical Council. Canon number 4. In accordance with the decision of Pope Stephen, we declare that lay persons, no matter how devout they may be, have no authority to dispose of anything belonging to the Church. Let him be judged guilty of sacrilege. Canon 5. We forbid marriages between blood relatives because they are forbidden by the divine and secular laws, and prohibited marriages in the direct line, ascending and descending in infinitum, and in the collateral line to the 7th degree of consanguinity inclusive. And the way this was applied in most of the countries, the last 3 of those degrees, meaning 5, 6, and 7, were considered impedient impediments, but not diriment impediments. So, seminarians, so a few terms here. Consanguinity. Sanguine is the Latin word for blood. So consanguinity means you're related with blood. The degrees of these relationships. So you count up to the common ancestor, and then down to the other person. So, like if a man, you see, if you're too closely related to a woman, you count up to the common ancestor and down, and you count each one. So, say, all right, you might think a brother and sister. You might think that that's 1st degree consanguinity, but it's not. So you count up to the common ancestor, which are the parents, and then down again. So it's 1 degree up to the parents, and then another degree down to the sibling. So you're related to your parents in the first degree and your sibling in the second degree. Now, suppose it's an aunt. All right, so you think, all right, you married, you related to your parents in the first degree, and the aunt is a sibling of one of your parents. So does that mean that's first degree? Or do you just jump over and say, 1 degree to the parent, then another degree over to the aunt, making it 2 degrees? No, you got to count up to the common ancestor. So you'd count up parents, grandparents, then down to the aunt. So 1, 2, 3. So you're actually related to your aunt or your uncle in the 3rd degree, and so on. So up to the 4th degree was considered an impedient impediment, which means it could be dispensed. Up to the 1st through 4th degrees were diriment impediments, which means they cannot be dispensed. But 5th, 6th, and 7th degrees could. Now, where this would come up most often is the aristocracy and the royalty, is that they only wanted to marry people in their own class, because the rest of us are scum. And so that meant that there was, many of them were related to each other. So that's where this would come up most often. All right, skipping down to Canon 11, regard to the Crusades. For effectively crushing the tyranny of the infidels, we grant to those who go to Jerusalem, and also to those who give aid toward the defense of the Christians, the remission of their sins, and we take under the protection of St. Peter and the Roman Church their homes, their families, and all their belongings, as was already ordained by Pope Urban II. Whoever, therefore, shall dare molest or seize these during the absence of their owners shall incur excommunication. So remember, Urban II is the one who called the First Crusade. So he had issued this too. It's like a protection for those who go on crusade, that they, that if they would choose to come back, that they come back and their homes not be taken over, by someone in their absence. All right, skipping down, Canon 13. The truce of God. Remember, this is a Cluny thing. We talked about this in the 10th century. The truce of God, the Tregea Dei, was a temporary suspension of hostilities, which is connected to the peace of God, the Pax Dei. Both proved ineffective. But the truce of God, in its earliest form, was a decision that no one should attack his enemy from 9 o'clock on Saturday night until 1 o'clock on Monday morning. And subsequently, this prohibition was extended in some localities to certain days of the week. So they might say, okay, Thursday, no homicide on Thursday, or no battles. This is really for battles. And then in some very ambitious places, so there should not be any homicide on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, because those are the days of the Triduum, the Easter Triduum. And then, of course, none on Sunday, because that's the day of the resurrection. Of course, widely ignored in an age of, feudalism where we are. Let's see, Canon 20. We decree that churches and their possessions, as well as the persons connected with them, namely clerics and monks and their servants, also the laborers and the things they use, shall remain safe. If anyone shall dare act contrary to this, and, recognizing his crime, does not, within the space of 30 days, make proper amends, let him be cut off from the church and anathematized. So this is stealing, basically just stealing from the church. Raiding the poor box. Canon 21, we absolutely forbid priests, deacons, and subdeacons, and monks to have concubines or to contract marriage. we decree, in accordance with the definitions of the sacred canons, that marriages already contracted by such persons must be dissolved, and that the persons be condemned to do penance. So this, we've seen this. Previous popes, all the Cluny popes had repeated this over and over, but those were just in papal decrees. This is the first time that's enshrined at the level of conciliar magisterium. Okay. All right. Previously, we covered how an ancient Manichaean sect, that's a dualist sect, heretical sect, was banished from the Byzantine Empire and settled in Bulgaria. Time passed while they cloned in isolation. A Bulgarian priest named Bogumil, Bogumil, lived from around 927 through around 970 AD. He imbibed the Paulicians. Remember that this is the Paulicians, who were Manichaean. He imbibed their Manichaean dualism and their iconoclasm and synthesized it with his own disgust at the endless bickering between Latin and Greek clergy for control of Bulgaria, and synthesized it into a new heretical sect called the Bogumils. They were iconoclast. They were adoptionist, so they denied the divinity of Christ. Believed Jesus was just a man, created man, who was adopted by God for a particular mission. And he was filled with power. He was filled with the miracles. He was filled with the ability to do miracles at his baptism in the Jordan when the Holy Spirit descended on him. He did not have that power by his own nature. They denied the real presence in the Eucharist. They were overtly anti-clerical, arguing that churches were not necessary, nor was holy orders, matrimony, monasteries, or convents. Yet they lived externally what appeared to be frugal and disciplined lives, which gave them the appearance of sanctity, and that enabled their heresy to grow beneath a mask of holiness. Their ideas spread throughout Europe, ironically through the monastic system, which they despised. As we saw, monasteries were connected to each other through their daughter houses that they would found other monasteries, and the monks maintained contact through writing. Here we encounter a curious but nonetheless persistent phenomenon in Catholic history, and that is self-loathing. Priests who hate the priesthood, monks who hate monasticism, nuns who hate religious life, Catholics who hate Catholicism. In this case, it was the monks who despised themselves and their vocation and the church who spread Bogomilism, effectively injecting it into the heart of Europe as it followed the trade routes from Bulgaria. Bulgaria is at the point where the Danube River intersects the Black Sea. So following the Danube into Central Europe, then the portage over to the Rhine, going up into Northern Europe. Now, imagine the effect of such self-loathing, anti-clerical attitudes in an environment where the church was being perpetually drawn into secular conflicts because it had become so integrated into feudalism, which included the problem, as we've seen time and again, of those being sent into the church by their families without a genuine vocation. Those marriages arranged by the families, regardless of the vocation of the individuals involved. So it is only with this context in mind that we can appreciate the explosion of Manichaean-style heresies in the 12th century, a time when Europe was almost entirely Catholic. There were some enclaves of Jews in Europe, but it was almost entirely Catholic. At the time of the Lateran Council, the Holy See had no means of knowing how extensive this was, but there were manifestations that had come to their attention and which were addressed at the council. Later in the century, the injection of Manichaeism into the Western Church erupted in France as the Albigensian heresy, which led to a civil war in France, a generational-long civil war. So we'll discuss that when we get to it in due course. So again, there is an account from the time about the Bogomils. This is from a Greek princess named Anna Komnena. She was the daughter of the Byzantine Emperor Alexis I. She lived from 1083 to 1153. So this account about the Bogomils she wrote around the year 1110. I'll skip right down. Quote, "A very great cloud of heretics arose, and the nature of their heresy was new, and hitherto unknown to the Church. For two very evil and worthless doctrines, which had been known in former times, now coalesced. The impiety, as it might be called, of the Manichaeans, which we also call the Paulician heresy, with the shamelessness of the Massalians. This was the doctrine of the Bogomils, compounded of the Massalians and the Manichaeans. And probably it existed even before my father's time." So she's writing, the name of her work is the Alexiad, which is basically a history of her family up to her time. So she's very admiring of her father, Alexis I. Probably existed even before my father's time, but in secret. For the sect of the Bogomils is very clever in aping virtue, and you would not find any long-haired worldling belonging to the Bogomils, for their wickedness was hidden under the cloak and the cowl. The cowl is the hood, the monastic hood. A Bogomil looks gloomy, and is covered up to the nose, and walks with a stoop, and mutters. But within, he is an uncontrollable wolf. And this most pernicious race, which was like a snake hiding in a hole, my father brought out to the light." Her father, Alexis I, reigned from 1081 to 1118. So she goes on like that for a while, so I'll pick up again further down. By this time, the fame of the Bogomils had spread everywhere, for Basil, a monk, was very wily in handling the impiety of the Bogomils. He had 12 disciples, whom he called apostles, and also dragged about with him some female disciples, wretched women of loose habits, and thoroughly bad, and he disseminated his wickedness everywhere. This evil attacked many souls like fire, and the emperor's soul could not endure it. So he began investigating the heresy. He had some Bogomils brought to the palace, and all proclaimed a certain Basil as the teacher and chief representative of the Bogomil heresy. Of these, one Diblatius was kept in prison, and as he would not confess when questioned, he was subject to torture, and then informed against the man called Basil, and the disciples he had chosen. Accordingly, the emperor entrusted several men with a search, and Sotanel, arch-satrap Basil, was brought to light, in monk's habit, with a withered countenance, clean-shaven and tall of stature. The emperor, wishing to elicit his inmost thought by compulsion, under the disguise of persuasion, at once invited the man on some religious pretext, and he even rose from his chair to greet him, made him sit by him and share his table, threw out his whole fishing line, and fixed various baits on the hooks for this voracious whale to devour. A curtain divided the women's apartments from the room where the two emperors sat with the wretch who blurted out and openly declared all he had in his soul, while a secretary, sitting on the inner side of the curtain, committed his words to writing. And the nonsense monger seemed to be the teacher, while the emperor pretended to be the pupil, and the secretary wrote down his doctrines. And that man, stricken of God, spun together all that horrible stuff, and did not shun any abominable dogma, but even despised our theology, and misrepresented all our ecclesiastical administration. And as for the churches, woe is me to say it, he called our sacred churches temples of the devil, and our consecration of the body and blood of our one and greatest high priest and victim, he considered and condemned as worthless. And what followed? The emperor threw off his disguise and drew the curtain aside, and the whole Senate was gathered together, and the military contingent mustered, and the elders of the church were present too. The episcopal throne of the Queen of Cities was at that time occupied by that most blessed of patriarchs, Lord Nicholas, the grammarian. Then the execrable doctrines were read out, and the proof was impossible to attack. And the defendant did not deny anything, but immediately bared his head and proceeded to counter-demonstrations, and professed himself willing to undergo fire, scourging, and 1,000 deaths. For these erring bogomils believe that they can bear any suffering without feeling pain, as the angels, forsooth, will pluck them out of the fire. And although all reproached him for his impiety, even those whom he had involved in his own ruin, he remained the same Basil, an inflexible and very brave bogomil. And although he was threatened with burning and other tortures, he clung fast to his demon and embraced his Satan. After he was consigned to prison, the emperor frequently sent for him and frequently exhorted him to forswear his impiety, but all the emperor's exhortations left him unchanged. Another heresy of this period, the Petrobrusian heresy. That's Petrobrusian. This is a curious heresy, which in some ways prefigures the Protestant movements, as did the Bogomils for that matter. Named for its founder, a heretical priest, Peter from the Diocese of Embrun, hence Peter Petrobrusian. Embrun is in southeastern France. He broke from the church around the year 1120. His preaching began prior to the First Lateran Council, but it had not made it onto the papal radar at that point, so it would be addressed by the next council, Lateran II. With regard to the Bible, Peter accepted only the 4 Gospels as canonical. He dismissed the entire Old Testament as obsolete after the resurrection. He also relegated the other books of the New Testament, meaning apart from the Gospels, to a lower level, the level of ancient writings, meaning that there were historical documents and valuable for that, but not containing any binding teachings. In terms of the sacraments, Peter denied the efficacy of infant baptism, demanding that baptism was only salvific for adults. He denied the efficacy of the Eucharist, because the sacrifice of Christ was made once and need not be repeated. And he denied purgatory, teaching that the prayers of the living cannot benefit the dead. In terms of ecclesiology, his theology of church, Peter reserved a special hatred for priests, monks, and nuns, viewing the institutional elements of the church as a hindrance to salvation, not a help. He promoted violence against them and was personally responsible for a series of clerical and religious homicides before he himself was killed by a mob in southern France. He was iconoclast, of course, and he reserved, he had a genuine, abiding, visceral hatred for sacred art, especially for the crucifix. He hated church buildings, teaching that they were unnecessary because worthy prayers were heard by God even if they were offered from a barn or outside. He gathered gangs of mentally unstable as well as criminal elements and used them to launch surprise raids on places of worship. In these raids, the clergy and religious would be killed. The sacred art would either be destroyed by fire, or if it was metal like gold or silver, it would be stolen and melted down. So you see, if you melt it down, then it's no longer impure. So you can steal the gold, like gold chalices or candlesticks or anything, and it's bad. So then it has to be vandalized. But then if you melt it down into gold coins or gold nuggets or gold bars, then it's okay. You see, then. All right. Pope Callistus died on December 14th, 1124, 1 year after Lateran I closed. Part of his success had been attributable to his connections through the marriage relationships of his family to the ruling houses of Europe. Remember, he was a son of the Count of Burgundy. This was not a pattern that the local Italian nobility wanted to become established, because they would prefer a weak pope, a pope who would therefore be dependent on them. So the Roman clergy, for the next election, turned to a rival Italian house, the House of Frangipani, who provided protection for the election of Pope 163. At the time, he was Cardinal Lamberto of Ostia. Ostia was the port of Rome. As Pope, he took the name Honorius I. It's spelled with an H, so honor, I-U-S, Honorius, Honorius II. He accepted election on December 21st, 1124. He had been made a bishop by Pope Pascal, who we talked about in the last session, and he was a close advisor of Pope Callistus during the First Lateran Council. There was an anti-pope at the time put forward by a rival Italian house. He was assassinated in 1125 by persons unknown. Shortly after, a procession of the Pope was ambushed by members of the House Pierleoni to satisfy the vendetta obligation over this assassination. And acolytes in the procession were killed, who no doubt had nothing at all to do with any of this. Pope Honorius was assassinated in Rome on the 13th of February, 1130. In the hope of avoiding another schism, when Pope Honorius died, or was murdered, his staff secretly buried him and summoned the cardinals to elect his successor before they announced his death to the public. This election selected one of their own, Cardinal Gregorio, who was a nobleman of the Italian house of Peperecci. That's P-A-P-A-R-E-S-C-H-I. He accepted election on February 23rd, 1130, and took the name Pope Innocent II. The Cluny people, the reformers, had already earned the vendetta of House Pierleoni over the assassination of the previous anti-pope. Even if they hadn't done it, they were going to get blamed for it. And here they earned the hostility of House Frangipani, who felt insulted that the election was held without their knowledge. House Pierleoni retaliated by proclaiming one of their own, who was a cardinal named Petro, proclaiming him as pope. So this is another anti-pope, which commenced yet another schism. This one would last for 8 years. Pope Innocent II did not have sufficient military protection to survive in Rome, so he fled to France, where St. Bernard, whom we met last time, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, took up his cause in persuading the houses of Europe that he was the rightful pope. Meanwhile, the Normans, the de Hautevilles dynasty in southern Italy, had been watching events in Rome with amusement and perceived an opportunity. The Norman king of Naples, Sicily, was Roger II. He appeared without warning, leading 1,000 Norman knights into Rome, where they proceeded to kill and pillage and do the Norman thing, until they captured the dons of most of the major Italian houses and held them for ransom. The Normans did not want to waste time looking for hidden treasure, so they simply had the nobility surrender the treasure themselves. Meanwhile, back in France, with St. Bernard on his side, Pope Innocent II won recognition from most of the royal houses of Europe, but still had the problem of regaining physical possession of Rome, with an antipope as well as a Norman regiment in the city. The first problem was solved when the Pierleoni antipope died, probably murdered, on January 25th, 1138. The Normans had not paid much attention to who was claiming to be pope, because their king, Roger II, had long ago been excommunicated for his many crimes and sins. But the death of the antipope provided a catalyst for House Pierleoni to try to manipulate the Normans, since they could not defeat the Normans in open battle. They did it this way. House Pierleoni approached King Roger with an offer of a marriage alliance between his house, the de Hautevilles, and their house, the House Pierleoni. In exchange for an immense dowry, they asked for his military support for the next antipope they put forward. King Roger agreed to the deal. House Pierleoni then proclaimed a member of the House Conti as antipope, as they had evidently run out of cardinals of their own bloodline. They next wrote to Pope Innocent II, still in France, offering to negotiate a settlement with the new antipope between him, Innocent, with the antipope and with the Normans. That would involve, they assured the Pope, this would involve the antipope's submission as well as the Norman recognition of him, Innocent, as the rightful pope. So you see, what this is a game. So Pierleoni puts up an antipope, and then they're off. They write to the real pope and off to negotiate a settlement between this antipope, pretending that it wasn't there. And then Innocent's in France, so it's very limited in what information he has. And also, the antipope was not of House Pierleoni, so that was another layer of concealment for the plan. The antipope was the House Conti. The scheme worked, and House Pierleoni, which had precipitated the schism, emerged as the peacemakers who negotiated the withdrawal of the Normans and allowed Pope Innocent to return in triumph. So it was this convoluted sequence of events that enabled Pope Innocent II to celebrate his return to Rome by summoning another church council. Thusly, history is made. So he summoned the Second Lateran Council in 1139, the year after his restoration. But before we get to him, before we get to that council, there are a few things we have to rewind a little to catch up with. One is in France. So Pope Innocent was in France, and there he met a guy who figures prominently in the history of medieval scholasticism, education, and universities. His name, he ended up being a bishop, Peter Lombard. Peter Lombard was, as the name suggests, Lombardy is northern Italy. He was born in northern Italy, just as St. Anselm, whom we've already met, and Lanfranc of Bec, whom we've already met. But he was of common lineage. I mean, not a serf, but also not a noble. He studied law at Bologna before traveling to France, earned a position as a teacher in the cathedral school of Notre Dame in Paris, Our Lady, the Cathedral of Our Lady in Paris, for the Diocese of Paris. There, in this new job, he began assembling texts that grew into a work called the 4 Books of Sentences. His prestige increased dramatically when he became Bishop of Paris. So then all of a sudden people are more interested in his work. And that in part accounts for how his work, the 4 Books of Sentences, replaced the 3 books of sentences of St. Isidore of Seville, which we encountered way earlier in the 7th century. We had a whole unit on him. And so what these are, these books of sentences are the anthologies. They're literally sentences, quotations from authoritative texts, from the Bible, from church fathers, church councils. The way Peter Lombard arranged his 4 books are Book 1 consisted of sentences, quotations pertaining to the Trinity. Book 2, sentences, quotations pertaining to creation. Book 3, quotations pertaining to Christ as Savior of creation. Book 4, quotations pertaining to sacraments and grace, which come through Christ. So Christ as the Savior of individuals within creation and the church. And, you know, in Isidore, we talked about the efficacy of this. So it's possible in an anthology, even today, to have quotations from hundreds of writers in an accessible form. You know, whereas certainly in the Middle Ages, where all this stuff had to be written by hand, nobody would be able to afford those hundreds of books. Even monasteries, it would take generations to assemble all those books. But these would be convenient textbooks. You know, so you get these 4 books, and then that serves you through your whole education, as you get all these quotations. Commenting on Peter Lombard's sentences, what became a standard rite of passage in medieval scholasticism. So to be recognized as a magister, a master, so we would think of as a master's degree. You know, now you have to write a thesis for that, but then you would comment publicly. And sometimes those commentaries, if they were good enough, would themselves be published. And that was a standard rite of passage. Even Aquinas, in the next century, Bonaventure in the next century, that was just part of their education. So the 4 books of sentences began circulating in 1134. 4 years later, 1138, another heretic priest who hated the priesthood, another Catholic who hated Catholicism, was Arnold of Brescia, Brescia. Brescia's in northern Italy, in Lombardy. He studied theology in Paris under the infamous Peter Abelard, whom we've already met and will meet again. And then Arnold returned home, back to Italy. He entered the church, rose to become prior of his community of canons regular. He witnessed a series of conflicts between the bishop of the city of Brescia and the secular authorities of the city, the Signoria, the city council. At issue between them were the by now familiar disputes over the political power of the secular versus the spiritual authority of the ecclesia, of the church, as well as some of the feudalism problems, specifically the economic power of the church, which owned vast number of fiefs on its own, as well as fiefs held in vassalage, which gave the church a large share of the wealth of the day. Remember, this is a money-poor economy, so it's a deflationary economic environment. So money is scarce. Therefore, wealth is not liquid. You know, not like, so the wealth is static in land and livestock. You know, but you need land to grow the livestock, or in crops, but you also need land to grow crops. So it gave the church. I mean, land is always has some intrinsic value, but there's sometimes in history when it's worth much more than others, and this was one of those times, because it was a deflationary environment. Both the political and economic conflicts in Brescia were driven by sin, by the sins of greed and the sin of pride that Satan has so often used to devastating effect in attacking the church. At some point in the late 1120s, Arnold thought he found a solution, and he began teaching it. He began with this assertion: all the problems which the church was then experiencing had their origin in church involvement with the feudal economic and political fabric of the day. Now, this is oversimplified. I mean, to say all problems would trace to that. But there is no denying, as we've seen, that the church's integration into feudalism brought temptations that would not otherwise be there to seek political and economic advantage. So just that assertion, while it's oversimplified, is not yet heretical. He went on. Second, he pointed to the offer made by Pope Paschal II to Emperor Henry V at Sutri in 1111, and I read you that earlier, last time, to ensure the independence of the church by surrendering all the fiefs which the church had held in vassalage to secular overlords. Again, that's not heretical, because the Pope, he had been willing to do that. Third, this is where Arnold moved into heresy. He began teaching that material ownership of anything material, was intrinsically detrimental to the church, such that bishops, priests, religious, with regalia, remember that's the vassal fiefs, the symbol, regalia is the symbol of the vassal fiefs that they held from secular authority, that any bishop, priest, or religious who held that cannot possibly be saved. All right, and that's going too far. That's arrogating to himself divine judgment. In 1138, Arnold escalated from heresy to schism and open revolution when Bishop Manfred of Brescia went on a journey to Rome seeking guidance and help in dealing with these issues. Arnold colluded with the secular nobility of Brescia, who were Lombards, in seizing church property, which is stealing church property, imprisoning church personnel who refused to surrender those properties. They then barred the city to prevent the bishop from returning to exercise his temporal authority. It was this act of revolution that brought Arnold to the attention of the Second Lateran Council, resulting, of course, in his condemnation. He spent the rest of his life as a wandering religious revolutionary until he was finally captured and executed in 1153. But rewinding, so he got violent in 1138. In the following year, April of 1139, the 10th Ecumenical Council was summoned by Pope Innocent II, attended by nearly 1,000 prelates. It is enumerated, it's the 10th Ecumenical Council, but it is the second held at the Lateran, the Second Lateran Council. It met from April 2nd through April 17th, 1139. Canon 1 repeats, almost verbatim, Canon 1 of the previous council, condemning simony, the purchase of ecclesiastical office, and stipulates that anyone who was ordained as a result of simony would lose that office. Skipping down, Canon 5. We decree that which was enacted by the Council of Chalcedon. Chalcedon met in 451, produced a number of canons. This is a reference to Canon 22. So Canon 5 of Lateran II is referring to Canon 22 of the Council of Chalcedon. Be inviolably observed, namely, that the possessions of deceased bishops be not seized by anyone, but that they remain in the hands of the steward and the clergy for the needs of the church and his successor. So this is another part of the feudalism problem. If the bishop was the younger son of an aristocratic family sent into the church only for the purpose of becoming bishop, then when he died, well, the family would go in and just basically loot, just clear out the bishop's residence, including the treasury. So this is an attempt to stop that. But remember, it's a basic principle of law that whenever generally if a law is made, it's because a law is made against something, it's because people were doing that thing. So obviously this was happening. Canon 6, again, a repeat. We also decree that those in the subdiaconate and higher orders, that's the top 4 orders, so subdeacon, deacon, priest, bishop were the 4 major orders. Those in those orders who have contracted marriage or have concubines be deprived of their office and ecclesiastical benefice. For since they should be and be called the temple of God, the vessel of the Lord, the abode of the Holy Spirit, it is unbecoming that they indulge in marriage and in impurities. Canon 7. Following in the footsteps of our predecessors, the Roman pontiffs, Gregory VII, Urban II, Pascal II, we command that no one attend the masses of those who are known to have wives or concubines, but that the law of continence and purity so pleasing to God may become more general among persons constituted in sacred orders. We decree that clerics who, transgressing the holy precept, have dared to contract marriage shall be separated. So they have to put aside their wives. Canon 8, we decree that the same be observed with regard to nuns, if, which God forbid, they attempt to marry. Canon 9, an evil and detestable custom, we understand, has grown up in the form that monks and canons regular, after having received the habit and made profession, despite the rule of the holy masters Benedict and Augustine, study jurisprudence and medicine for the sake of temporal gain. That means to make money. We decree, therefore, in virtue of our apostolic authority, that offenders of this kind be severely punished. Doesn't say anathema, doesn't say excommunication, or deprived of office, which previous penalties were. It just says severely punished, but does not stipulate what that is. Canon 10, this is the investiture problem. We forbid that tithes of churches be possessed by laymen. It's also a feudalism problem. Skipping down, Canon 12, the truce of God. They were still trying to neutralize the propensities to violence. So they decree that the truce of God be observed from the setting of the sun on Wednesday to its rising on Monday. So no killing, no homicide, no battle, from Wednesday night to Monday morning. And from Advent to the octave of Epiphany, so the first Sunday of Advent through the week after, so 4 or 5, so like 5 weeks. No killing for 5 weeks. And from Quinquagesima to the octave of Easter. So that's the Sunday before Ash Wednesday through the 8th day after Easter. And anyone who violates this is to be excommunicated. Skipping down, Canon 14. This is striking. We condemn absolutely those detestable jousts and tournaments in which the knights usually come together by agreement and, to make a show of their strength and boldness, rashly engage in contests which are frequently the cause of death to men and danger to souls. If anyone, taking part in them, should meet his death, though penance and viaticum shall not be denied him if he asks for them, he shall, however, be deprived of Christian burial. That's very striking. Canon 15. If anyone, at the instigation of the devil, incurs the guilt of this sacrilege, namely, that he has laid violent hands on a cleric or monk, he shall be anathematized, and no bishop shall dare absolve him, except mortis urgente periculo, in danger of death, till he be presented to the apostolic see and receive its mandate. We command also that no one shall dare lay hands on those who have taken refuge in a church or cemetery. Anyone doing this, let him be excommunicated. So physical assault of an ordained person or a monk, excommunicated, reserved to the Holy See. So even the local bishop could not absolve them of that excommunication. And also reiterating the right of sanctuary, that the church, believe it or not, the church did once enjoy that, could offer shelter to those on the run in a church or a cemetery. Holy ground, in other words. All right, skipping down, Canon 17. This is on the consanguinity thing again. We absolutely forbid marriages between blood relatives. The declarations of the Holy Fathers and of the Holy Church of God condemn incest of this kind, which, encouraged by the enemy of the human race, that's Satan, has become so widespread. Even the civil laws brand with infamy and dispossess all hereditary rights those born of such unions. And again, this is the aristocracy and the royalty, because they only wanted to marry. They had this thing about, blood, that their blood was better than everyone else's, so they didn't want to pollute their blood by marrying someone beneath them. Skipping down, Canon 21. We decree that the sons of priests must be barred from the ministry of the altar unless they become monks or canons regular. All right, that's interesting. So they've obviously already condemned. So now this is passing on a punishment to the child of a married priest just because his father married and was a priest. All right, so ministry of the altar means they could not be ordained a priest. But these exceptions, unless they become monks. Now, as we've seen, not all monks were priests. Monasticism is its own vocation, a distinct vocation. Not all of them are ordained. Now, canons regular, we talked about that earlier when we talked about the rule of St. Chrodegon, who was Bishop of Metz. He wrote his rule, Canorum Canon Regularum. So the canons regular, those are what we would call now diocesan priest, but they lived in community, attached to a particular church, and they did live according to a rule, the rule of St. Chrodegon. Excuse me.